first lecture of the 9th Annual A.V. Elliott Conference on Great Books and Ideas, sponsored by Mercer's McDonald Center for America's Founding Principles. We're very excited that you could join us here tonight, and we're excited about the lecture. We were treated earlier this afternoon to a wonderful panel of Mercer students, and we're looking forward to the rest of the conference. I hope you are all able to pick up one of these rack cards when you came in that gives you the schedule for tomorrow. We start back here at 9 a.m. in the morning and continue through to 3 with faculty panels. We'll have faculty panels on the founders, on 1776 and the Scottish Enlightenment, and the context and legacy of 1776. And then tomorrow evening at this time right here will be the closing lecture by Gordon Lloyd, titled 1776, A Synopsis. So I do want to welcome you here tonight and introduce our tonight's speaker and also say a bit about the conference. I'd also like to thank some people. I'd like to thank Charlie Thomas for her work with the center as my co-director of the McDonald Center. I'd like to thank the Elliott family for their generous endowment, which has given this conference a permanent life at the university. And no member of the Elliott family could be here tonight. Mr. Elliott is recovering from a recent stay in the hospital, and so we wish them the best. I'd also like to thank the McDonald family for endowing the center and the work that we do throughout the year at the center. And several members of the McDonald family are here, and I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Thomas and Ramona McDonald for their continued support of the work at the center. The rack card tells a little bit about the center, and I'm gonna you can indulge me while I quote from it, but so you can read along with me if you'd like. But the McDonald Center for America's Founding Principles supplements Mercer University's liberal arts program with a redoubled commitment to the foundational texts and ideas which have shaped Western civilization and the American political order. This focus on the core texts of the Western tradition helps to revitalize a cross-century dialogue about citizenship, human rights, and political, economic, and religious freedom, thereby deepening the moral imagination and fostering civic and cultural literacy. The theme for this year's conference is 1776, and this is a year near and dear to the central mission of the McDonald Center. And it's a year that's not only primary for the American regime, which we'll hear some of that over the next 2 days, but it's a really important year for Western civilization in general. There's lots of important happenings. Here's just some dates for us to consider, at home and abroad. On January 2nd, January 2nd, 1776, the first revolutionary flag in America is raised. The country, or the colonies, are already engaged in the Revolutionary War. January 10th, Thomas Paine publishes Common Sense. On February 8th, Goethe's Stella premieres in Hamburg, Germany. February 17th, Edward Gibbon publishes in Britain The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, maybe a theme of relevant importance in relation to existing empires. On March 9th, Adam Smith publishes The Wealth of Nations. On June 11th, back in the colonies, a committee is formed to draft the Declaration of Independence. The committee is made up of Jefferson, Adams, Franklin, Sherman, and Livingston. July 4th, we know. Right? The Declaration is announced to the world. On July 11th, the third voyage of James Cook is made to explore the world. In terms of the war, during the spring 1776, the revolutionaries are successful around Boston. But throughout the summer and into the fall, there's a series of failures as they lose New York. Washington and his army retreat across New Jersey in a series of battles. On August 25th, David Hume dies. On September 9th, the United States is used, of the United States of America is used for the first time to describe the former colonies of Great Britain. The new name is, it was United Colonies, now they're the United States of America. On October 18th, we don't have a panel on this, but I learned on October 18th, 1776, the word cocktail was first used. We may do more research on that later tonight, but that's not a public panel. And I think after July 4th, of course, probably the climactic event of 1776 in American context is on the night of Christmas, December 25th. Washington crosses the Delaware. And on the 26th, wins the Battle of Trenton, the first major victory of the American Revolution, making a case on the battlefield that this wild, crazy experiment might actually have legs. So it's a pretty important year. And we're interested in the McDonald Center and exploring as many of these things as we can, except maybe the cocktail. Okay. But it gives me great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker. She's a professor of political science at Loyola University, Maryland. She received her undergraduate degree from Kenyon College and her PhD from the University of Chicago. She's the author of a very fine book on Montesquieu, titled Erotic Liberalism, Women and Revolution in Montesquieu's Persian Letters. I would highly recommend both Persian Letters and her book on Persian Letters. She's co-editor of a wonderful anthology celebrating the treasures of American civic education, titled What So Proudly We Hail, The American Soul in Story, Speech, and Song, which brings to a wide audience a little of what we're trying to do with the McDonald Center in terms of civic education. In addition to her academic work, she's an important contributor to the nation's intellectual life through her prolific work in journals such as National Affairs, The New Criterion, The Public Interest, The American Enterprise, Claremont Review of Books, Commentary, First Things, The American Interest, City Journal, and The New Atlantis, where she serves as contributing editor. Along the way, she's written about everything from Benjamin Franklin, Abraham Lincoln, and Alexis de Tocqueville to Captain Kirk and the American Western. And I want to talk to her later about Shane, which is one of my favorite movies and apparently one of her favorites too. She's a member of the Hoover Institution's Task Force on the Virtues of a Free Society. She's been awarded the Richard Weaver Prize for Scholarly Letters and served from 2004 to 2009 on the President's Council on Bioethics. Her lecture tonight is titled Abraham Lincoln and the Daughters of Dred Scott, a reflection on the Declaration of Independence. Please join me in welcoming Diana Schaub.
Thank you, Will, for that lovely introduction. I'm delighted to be here and to talk about 1776. 77 years ago. Those words alone might serve to justify a lecture on Lincoln at a conference devoted to 1776. Since that first clause of the Gettysburg Address refers to the year of the nation's birth, Lincoln could have begun his speech by saying, "In 1776, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal." Or he could have said, "Through the Declaration of Independence, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal." Instead, he made his audience and all subsequent readers do a fair bit of arithmetic in order to puzzle out the date. For those of you not familiar with Old English terms of measurement, like a bushel and a peck, or an ell and a dram, a score is a period of 20 years. Fourscore, 4 times 20, and 7 plus 7 equals 87 years. Lincoln's Gettysburg Address was delivered in 1863. Subtracting 87 from that date takes you back to 1776. It's often said that Lincoln must have chosen his opening phrase because it sounded more poetic than the alternative. But I must say it's an odd form of poetry that requires so many mathematical operations, from multiplication to addition to subtraction. The phrase fourscore and 7 does, of course, evoke the beautiful language and cadence of the King James Bible. Lincoln's audience would have been familiar with the 90th Psalm, which numbered the human lifespan at 70, or at most 80. Many of them would also have known the reason given for why the life of man is so soon cut off. The reason is that we spend our days in labor and sorrow, consumed by God's wrath. By thus alluding to Scripture's harsh verdict on the lifespan of sinners, Lincoln forces us to wonder whether there are similar limits on the lifespan of mankind's political collectives. The nation, at 77, is now just beyond the furthest term of an individual life. Moreover, as the audience well knows, and Lincoln soon acknowledges, the nation is engaged in a terrible civil war, a war that may cause the nation to perish. But before he even gets to any mention of the war, in this opening paragraph, which seems to be a purely admiring description of the achievement of the Founding Fathers, Lincoln is able to strike a darker note, a note of inevitable and perhaps incipient death, through this phrase, 77. In the ears of Americans, 1776 always has a hopeful and joyous ring to it. Even though it's a date from the past, it looks forward. It smiles on the future. By contrast, 77 years ago has a somber resonance. It hints at the passing away of the days of our years. So yes, it is poetic, but not in the sense of a flowery fancying up of ordinary speech. Rather, like all genuine poetry, it imbues language with more complex and multi-layered meanings, meanings that work upon and move the audience, whether they are aware of it or not. One final observation about the word score. In its oldest denotation, it describes an activity that can be traced all the way back to the Paleolithic era, when numerical records were kept by scoring, which is to say cutting or notching a piece of ivory or bone or wood. The scored item, sometimes called a tally stick, was employed as a mnemonic device, a way of keeping track of the passage of time or other quantities that stretched beyond the verge of human memory. So we might say that Lincoln begins the Gettysburg Address by presenting the nation's tally stick, or scorecard. Again, it's highly significant that the nation's scorecard has just exceeded the scorecard of any individual. Because no one in his audience at that moment in 1863 could have been a participant in the events of 1776, American citizens were in need of new, more permanent, less flesh-bound forms of remembrance. Lincoln had been aware of this need since his Lyceum address in 1838, when he noted that the veterans of the Revolution had nearly all gone to rest, and with them had gone the living memory, the living history of the scenes of the Revolution. In effect, what Lincoln does in the first paragraph of the Gettysburg Address is carve a solid and enduring substitute. He condenses the meaning of the Declaration into one sentence. His formulation of what happened in 1776 is lapidary, a sentence that can be scored into memory. This immortal sentence is a culmination of reflections on the Declaration that Lincoln had been intensely engaged in for the past decade at least. After the authors themselves, and maybe more than the authors themselves, Lincoln is the greatest expositor and disciple of the Declaration. Speaking from Independence Hall in Philadelphia on the birthday of George Washington, no less, President-elect Lincoln made a striking claim. He said that he had, quote, never had a feeling politically that did not spring from the sentiments embodied in the Declaration of Independence. Beginning with his eulogy of Henry Clay in 1852, Lincoln had been not only appealing to the Declaration, but presenting interpretations of it in nearly every major speech he gave, as well as in letters, even developing further arguments on scraps of paper, which he did either just to work through the arguments for himself or possibly for future use in speeches. Fittingly, after delivering the Gettysburg Address, Lincoln makes no further statements about the Declaration. His thought had achieved its final form. Moreover, the dedication to a new birth of freedom with which the Gettysburg Address concludes marks a decisive moment, the beginning, we might say, of a new scorecard, a card that has been scored with the blood sacrifice of these honored dead. The scenes of the Civil War will rival in American memory the scenes of the Revolution, just as the sentences of Lincoln rival those of Jefferson. Now, this doesn't mean that the Declaration has been superseded. Far from it. After all, it was by returning to the Declaration and by delineating the practices and policy which harmonize with it that Lincoln was able to meet the challenge posed by slavery. Often today, the persistence of slavery into the 19th century is viewed as a reason for disparaging the founders. Lincoln, however, did not think they were to blame for the worsening situation, which he attributed rather to the failures of subsequent generations, beginning around the 1830s. Lincoln, in fact, credited the founding generation with having contained slavery, a feat they achieved despite the extreme weakness of federal power under both the Articles of Confederation and the new Constitution. As he put it, they hemmed it in to the narrowest limits of necessity. They also forthrightly condemned slavery as a moral and political evil. Lincoln saw his own policy as faithful to the founders' intentions by banning slavery in the territories and thereby keeping slavery quarantined in the existing slave states. Slavery could be put back on the path toward eventual extinction, which was the path on which he believed the founders had originally placed it. Sorry. All right, after this fairly elaborate stage setting, I would like to zero in on one speech of Lincoln's, his June 1857 speech in response to the infamous Dred Scott decision. This speech contains one of his clearest explanations of what he believed the founders meant in declaring all men are created equal. That's the page that was distributed to you in the beginning, so hang on to that. We're going to take a close look at it. If you didn't get one, there might be some circulating around. After exploring this central passage, I will then look at three other moments in the speech that show Lincoln applying the Declaration in very concrete but somewhat surprising ways. And what I find fascinating is that in all three of these passages, they all involve women. Out of all Lincoln's speeches, his Dred Scott speech is unique for its density of female references. Now, Lincoln's main purpose in this Dred Scott speech was to correct a dangerous misreading of the Declaration put forth by his Democratic political opponents. In particular, Roger Taney. Taney, remember, was Chief Justice of the Supreme Court and the author of the Dred Scott ruling. And his other opponent, Stephen Douglas, the leading Democrat in the Senate and Lincoln's longtime rival, who had just delivered his own speech in support of the Dred Scott decision just 2 weeks earlier, 2 weeks before Lincoln's speech. Lincoln's generation, no less than our own, struggled to make sense of the stark contrast between the Declaration's ringing endorsement of mankind's natural equality and the ongoing existence of chattel slavery. No one at that time wanted to denounce the founders as hypocrites. We are sort of much more ready to take that route today. But at this time, they did not want to denounce the founders as hypocrites. So one way to rescue the founders from the charge that they said one thing and did another was to simply read blacks out of the Declaration. And that is what both Taney and Douglas did. They argued that all men really meant all white men. I want to read you a quote from Stephen Douglas. "Can any sane man believe that the signers of the Declaration of Independence intended to place the Negro race on an equal footing with the white race? If such had been their purpose, would they not have abolished slavery? and converted every Negro into a citizen on the day on which they put forth the Declaration of Independence. No one can vindicate the character, motives, and conduct of the signers, except upon the hypothesis that they referred to the white race alone, and not to the African when they declared all men to have been created equal. That they were speaking of British subjects on this continent being equal to British subjects born and residing in Great Britain. Now, Lincoln rejected that exclusionary, white supremacist interpretation as nonsensical. He said that it did obvious violence to the plain, unmistakable language of the Declaration. And Lincoln reiterated the original, expansive, and inclusive reading of the Declaration. At the same time, Lincoln honestly acknowledged the distance, the gap, between the founders' theoretical principles and their political practice. He didn't think that the gap between words and deeds made them hypocrites, however. He emphasized the insuperable obstacles the founders faced in trying to reform unjust practices. He reminded his audience that democratic statesmen, constrained as they always are by tradition and public opinion, are not free to place folks, whether black or white, instantly on a footing of full equality. That limitation does not mean that the words of the Declaration are empty platitudes. Properly understood, they vitalize and guide political life. Let me now read aloud the central passage from Lincoln's speech. And this is a portion of the text that you have in front of you, so if you want to follow along. I think the authors of that notable instrument intended to include all men, but they did not intend to declare all men equal in all respects. They did not mean to say all were equal in color, size, intellect, moral developments, or social capacity. They defined with tolerable distinctness in what respects they did consider all men created equal, equal in certain inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This they said, and this meant. They did not mean to assert the obvious untruth that all were then actually enjoying that equality, nor yet that they were about to confer it immediately upon them. In fact, they had no power to confer such a boon, a good thing. They meant simply to declare the right so that the enforcement of it might follow as fast as circumstances should permit. They meant to set up a standard maxim for free society which could be familiar to all and revered by all, constantly looked to, constantly labored for, and even though never perfectly attained, constantly approximated, and thereby constantly spreading and deepening its influence and augmenting the happiness and value of life to all people of all colors everywhere. According to Lincoln, human beings are equal, but they aren't equal every which way. They are equal only in a highly specific way. Before specifying that way, however, Lincoln first details some of the manifold ways in which humans are unlike one another. He says they are not the same in color, size, intellect, moral developments, or social capacity. That is an intriguing list. It begins with two visible, natural differences, color and size. If we think about how contemporary society approaches human difference, the first two categories that probably spring to mind are race and gender. Lincoln's categories may have some connection to those, but they're definitely not identical to them. Let's take color first. Given that Lincoln's dispute with Tawney and Douglas concerned the founding era's view of black people, it isn't surprising that Lincoln begins by acknowledging a difference that presents itself to all eyes. Human beings don't look the same. They come in different colors. In the speech that Stephen Douglas had delivered 2 weeks earlier, he spoke repeatedly of the African race and other inferior races. He also spoke of the superior white race. Lincoln, by contrast, rarely ever utters the term race. Instead of dividing human beings into fixed categories, Lincoln presents the difference between blacks and whites as a purely superficial difference of skin tone. Moreover, in other writings, he points out that skin tone is not actually binary, black and white. It's really a matter of degree, lighter and darker. Thus, he warns slaveholders that if they regard whiteness as a title to mastery, they can't escape the logical conclusion that they themselves should be enslaved to the first person who comes along with paler skin than their own. By speaking of color rather than race, Lincoln suggests, I think, the existence of a spectrum of infinite gradations. Although he highlights this visible difference of color among human beings, he hints at its individual rather than class character. He bridges the racial divide with a rainbow, such that by the end of this passage, he is able to envision all people of all colors everywhere enjoying the benefits of free society. What about size? The next element in the list. Whereas an individual's color remains constant, size changes dramatically over the life cycle. Each of us starts as an extraordinarily tiny, indeed embryonic being, only gradually attaining our mature form. Even in adulthood, weight, unlike height, is notoriously subject to fluctuation, as all dieters know. Differences in size are not purely individual, since they can be correlated with certain category differences. For instance, adults are generally larger than children. Males, on average, are larger and stronger than females. However, mostly what we see is an array of individual differences, from short to tall and light to heavy. So size, like color, is spread along a continuum. Built upon these two properties, the visible spectacle of humanity is astonishingly varied. What we experience is not sameness, but diversity. The next and central item on Lincoln's list is intellect. He has moved from external to internal differences among human beings. He has also moved from qualities that are given by nature to a quality that is more complex, inasmuch as intellect has long been thought to have both a natural and acquired components. Differences with respect to intellect can also be a very significant driver of economic and social inequality. We know that Lincoln's overall aim in this passage is to define and defend the self-evident truth of equality. What we note is that equality in the sense intended by the Declaration can be vigorously upheld, while at the same time one can admit that there is a range of intellect among human beings, a range that presumably entails differences in degree of intellect, from dumb to brilliant, as well as differences in type of intellect, as for instance verbal as compared to spatial abilities. We know how dangerous it can be when people make assumptions about intellect on the basis of other categories, like race. Lincoln lessens the likelihood of that by refusing to employ race as a category, instead treating all these differences as individual in nature. The fourth item on the list is moral developments. This phrase is interesting, since it suggests that good morals must be instilled. Even if there is such a thing as a conscience or an inborn moral compass, it requires support, it requires development. Because of the effects of early habituation on our moral formation, institutions like the family, the church, the political order itself can profoundly influence, if not determine, the degree of one's moral development. Unfortunately, these institutional influences can sometimes be harmful. Thus, the long-continued existence of an unjust practice, like slaveholding, might compromise one's moral development. Slaveholding had the power to corrupt family life, religious faith, and fidelity to the principles of Republican self-government. Certainly, Lincoln believed that many Americans had already veered off into the hateful paths of despotism. It turns out that human differences are not simply individual in nature. Rather, those differences can assume intractable social and political shapes which can imperil the achievement of justice. The final item on Lincoln's list is social capacity. What, one wonders, is this? Lincoln seems to be saying that human beings differ in their ability or power or fitness for social interaction. Well, we know, of course, that there are introverts and extroverts. Extremely shy individuals might find it hard to participate in social activities, while extremely overbearing individuals might find themselves less than welcome at social gatherings. We also know that some forms of social disability are so extreme as to be considered antisocial pathologies. Whatever that range of individual possibilities, we might also wonder whether the notion of social capacity implies that human beings are by nature social creatures. Aristotle famously argued that not only are we social by nature, gregarious by nature, but political as well, by which he meant that we are justice-seeking beings who must live in political community with others in order to achieve our highest flourishing. Of course, other political theorists, especially those we term modern, have argued contrarily that human beings are originally asocial or apolitical, exclusively concerned with their own individual self-preservation. Such atomized individuals might be driven into political association out of desperation, but they're not drawn there by the higher longings of their souls. Lincoln's suggestive phrase, social capacity, doesn't tell us how he viewed this matter, other than that he thought human beings manifested some degree of difference with respect to social capacity, whether as a result of natural gifts or acquired sensibilities, whether as individuals or political collectives. We note also that the previous category of moral developments might have some bearing on this ultimate quality of social capacity. So, for instance, a people with a long history of living under the rule of law and with the moral developments to match might be more ready for the rigorous demands of self-government as compared to a people who have suffered under generations of tyrannical rule, or a people who have grown used to ruling over others tyrannically. In other words, neither slavery nor mastery prepares one for the self-restraint at the moral heart of government of the people, by the people, for the people. So, a little reflection on Lincoln's list shows, I think, how carefully constructed it is. It ascends from simpler physical differences to more complex, multidimensional differences. It also aims to be comprehensive, capturing the tremendous variety of humanity, variety in appearance, in faculties, in character. The list also hints at a difficult question. What account, if any, must be taken of these inequalities in a just political system? Having then acknowledged the scope of differences among men, Lincoln returns to the matter of our essential similarity. What is the precise respect in which human beings are alike? Lincoln quotes directly from the Declaration. We possess inalienable rights, which is to say, rights that belong to us by virtue of the kind of creature we are. According to Lincoln, there shouldn't be any confusion about the meaning of equality. Equality isn't some vague generality. Quite the contrary, the Declaration offers a definition of its central concept. Equality means equality with respect to natural rights. None of the significant differences among human beings, which Lincoln went to the trouble of listing, invalidates the equal entitlement to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Lincoln's verdict here, I think, echoes that of the Declaration's main author. In a letter to the French abolitionist Henri Grégoire, Thomas Jefferson insisted that intellectual differences were irrelevant to the truth of natural rights. Quote, because Sir Isaac Newton was superior to others in understanding, he was not therefore lord of the person or property of others. Rights are not contingent on anything but membership in what Lincoln calls the human family. This phrase is a direct riposte to Stephen Douglas, who had insisted that our fathers did not regard the Negro race as any kin to them. Lincoln's next step in his analysis of the Declaration is crucial to his moral vindication of the revolutionary generation. He considers again what the authors did not intend to say. While they were deadly serious about the truth of human equality, they knew full well that not all were, as Lincoln puts it, actually enjoying that equality. Indeed, by their assessment, they themselves were not enjoying equal rights. That, after all, is why they wrote the Declaration, to present to the world the evidence of their oppression as justification for their independence from Great Britain. By focusing on what the founders did not mean to say, Lincoln reminds his audience of how insecure rights are and how often they are violated. Indeed, most people in most times and most places have not enjoyed the equality to which they were entitled. What did the authors of the Declaration propose to do about this nearly universal disrespect for the rights of man? According to Lincoln, they had no power to set the world immediately to rights. Remember, at the time it was pretty unclear whether the colonists would have sufficient power to reclaim their usurped rights, much less anyone else's. It would take 8 years of war against the British Empire to achieve the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitled them. Having dashed any utopian hopes about perfect equality, Lincoln concludes with 2 ringing sentences stating what the founders did mean. They declared the right, and by doing so generated the expectation that the enforcement would follow ASAP. Whereas the Declaration of Right is universal and absolute, the enforcement of right is dependent on circumstances. So, to take the case of black slavery, by the premises of the Declaration, it is undeniable that black persons possessed a natural right to liberty that was being wrongfully denied by the laws and practices of the colonists. The rectification of that injustice was neither quick nor easy. As it turned out, it required a civil war, followed by the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution, and then a long, torturous process of societal reconstruction stretching over the next century and into our own. But what must be stressed is Lincoln's conviction that the Declaration of Right in 1776 was itself epoch-making. It established a lodestar, or what Lincoln calls a standard maxim, guiding incremental improvement, or at least shining the torch of reason on oppression. Without that clearly articulated standard, there would be no inherent pressure for reform. This is a truly new thing. A government that has within itself a principle of self-correction. Fidelity to the origins, indeed, fidelity to the point of reverence, becomes the engine of perpetual progress. It's by going back to the Declaration that we go forward. According to Lincoln, the spread of equal liberty is not limited to the United States. The Declaration of Independence is global in its reach, not because the United States will impose regime change by force, but because awareness of the foundations of free society moves men longingly towards it. Knowledge of the truth, that it should be familiar to all, produces attachment to the truth, that it should be revered by all, which in turn produces action on behalf of the truth, that it be constantly labored for. So that's the main passage. Now, as promised, the part about how women fit into this. Now, we might just start by asking ourselves what we already know on the topic of Lincoln and women. Well, we know he was rather awkward around women, that he waffled terribly before he finally carried through on his engagement with Mary Todd, and we know that she proved a difficult wife. We also know of his sensitivity to the suffering of women who lost loved ones during the Civil War. Think of his inexpressibly touching letter to Mrs. Bixby, the mother who lost 5 sons in battle, or his call to care for the war widows at the close of the second inaugural. 2 final tidbits of information. We know that Lincoln supported at least a qualified vote for women as early as 1836. And we know that late in 1860, he grew his beard in response to the suggestion of an 11-year-old girl, Miss Grace Bedell. What is less commonly noted about her suggestion is that it hinged on a claim about the indirect power of women, the indirect political power of women. In her letter, Miss Bedell writes, "All the ladies like whiskers, and they would tease their husbands to vote for you, and then you would be president." Whether simply to oblige Miss Bedell or in the belief that facial hair might indeed garner him a few more votes, Lincoln acted on the advice of this girlish political consultant. So while Lincoln was not what one would call a ladies' man, I think, it seems that he did follow the famous advice of Abigail Adams to remember the ladies. And nowhere is this more powerfully on display than in the Dred Scott speech. In the opening paragraphs, before outlining his response to the controversial Supreme Court decision, Lincoln makes some brief remarks about the situation in the territory of Utah, where the Mormons were taking up arms against the U.S. government. Now, Lincoln doesn't spend very much time on the practical question of what to do about the Mormon rebellion. Stephen Douglas, remember, he's responding to Stephen Douglas's speech, and Stephen Douglas had a proposal for how to deal with this Mormon rebellion. What Lincoln does instead is to shift the discussion to the underlying moral question of polygamy. Remember, at the time, plural marriage was part of the religious doctrine of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It is estimated that 1/3 of Mormon women were in polygamous marriages. The Republican platform of 1856 had linked polygamy and slavery. It had denounced them as the twin relics of barbarism and had called upon Congress to prohibit both practices in the territories. In other words, the Republicans stood not only for the prohibition of slavery in the territories, but also the prohibition of polygamy in the territories. Now, it's worth noting that the main reason polygamy was considered barbarous was because it involved the subordination of women to the patriarchal authority of men. Furthermore, because family structure and political structure are linked, sexual despotism in the household was regarded as the handmaiden of despotic, theocratic rule. Think today about the status of women in Islam, and you can see that domestic matters are not unconnected with the fate of political liberty. So what Lincoln tries to do is to force his political opponent, Stephen Douglas, to take a position on the morality or immorality of polygamy, something that Douglas had absolutely refused to do on the subject of slavery, where Stephen Douglas professed not to care whether voters in the territories embraced or rejected slavery. According to Douglas's doctrine of popular sovereignty, residents of the territories had a sacred right to decide all matters for themselves on the basis of local majority rule. So what Lincoln is doing is he's testing the limits of Douglas's view that majorities composed of white males, can do whatever they like, whether it be to keep a stable of black men as slaves or a stable of white women as sex slaves. He's trying to puncture Douglas's stance of non-judgmentalism or moral neutrality. While Douglas can perhaps get away with saying that he doesn't care one way or the other about slavery, since the nation is about evenly split on that issue, he can't adopt that strategy with respect to Mormon polygamy, which had triggered vehement public outrage. Remember, the reason that the Mormons were all the way out there in the Utah desert was because they'd been chased out of all the other places that they had tried to settle. So, the first woman-centered passage deals with polygamy. Now, for the second passage. Just about the only thing that Stephen Douglas did express moral disapproval of was any kind of intimate mixing between the races. When Republicans insisted that slavery was wrong and that all human beings had a natural right to liberty, Douglas argued, well, that must mean that the Republicans endorse full social and political equality for blacks. And you know what that means. As he summarized it, if the Declaration of Independence applies to the African race, that would, quote, authorize Negroes to marry white women on an equality with white men, end quote. Douglas did all he could to stoke white fear, which is to say white male fear, of miscegenation, of the fear that a daughter of theirs would bring home a Negro, the guess who's coming to dinner kind of fear. Female supporters of Douglas even embroidered their dresses with the slogan, "White men or none." Given the inflamed state of public opinion, Lincoln had to deny that intermarriage was the end point, the logical terminus of his anti-slavery position. And he does so in a most interesting way. Here's what he says. Now I protest against that counterfeit logic, which concludes that because I do not want a black woman for a slave, I must necessarily want her for a wife. I need not have her for either. I can just leave her alone. In some respects, she certainly is not my equal. But in her natural right to eat the bread she earns with her own hands without asking leave of anyone else, she is my equal and the equal of all others. Note that Lincoln speaks of a black woman rather than a black man, and that he shows the illogic of Douglas's claim by making himself the illustrative example. Lincoln hates slavery, and yet does not seek a black wife, while denying that he is any kind of advocate for amalgamation. Lincoln does not give any credence to the overheated fears of the white racial imagination. His example skirts all those nasty stereotypes about predatory black men. Instead, in what I think is a very deft rhetorical move, he turns his disavowal of race mixing into an endorsement of the essential equality and independence of women. Speaking of this hypothetical black woman, Lincoln says that he need not have her as either a slave or a wife. He can just let her be. Allow her to go about her business as a self-determining agent. I'm reminded of the great black leader, Frederick Douglass, who is not to be confused with Stephen Douglas. Stephen Douglas is the white Democrat with one S. Frederick Douglass is the black abolitionist with two S's. Mixing those two up on a final exam is grounds for failing the course. Okay. All right, so here's what Frederick Douglass said. What I ask for the Negro is not benevolence, not pity, not sympathy, but simply justice. The American people have always been anxious to know what they shall do with us. And I have had but one answer from the beginning: do nothing with us. Your doing with us has already played the mischief with us. Do nothing with us. All I ask is, give the Negro a chance to stand on his own legs. Let him alone. If you see him on his way to school, let him alone. Don't disturb him. If you see him going to the dinner table at a hotel, let him go. If you see him going to the ballot box, let him alone. Don't disturb him. If you see him going into a workshop, just let him alone. Your interference is doing him a positive injury. Lincoln's statement embodies this same liberal attitude, liberal in the authentic sense of leaving individuals free to exercise their talents and pursue their interests. Now, I suspect that contemporary listeners might be put off by Lincoln saying that this woman is in some respects not his equal. I must say I'm not bothered by it at all, since I don't regard myself, or indeed anyone I've ever met, as Lincoln's equal, except, of course, in the respect that he mentions, that of having an equal natural right to enjoy the fruits of one's own labor. Having accorded this black woman equal respect, Lincoln moves immediately to his consideration of the meaning of the Declaration's Equality Clause, that passage that I began with, that we spent some time going through. Nothing could be clearer than that for Lincoln, all men includes not only black men, but all women as well, since his leading example of a person entitled to natural rights is a black woman. All right, so that's the second passage. Now for the third and final passage about women. I definitely need more water for this one. This last passage comes directly after Lincoln has finished his commentary on the individual rights doctrine of the Declaration. Since Stephen Douglas is frightening whites in the free states away from their belief in individual rights by hinting that black freedom would endanger the purity of white womanhood, Lincoln returns once more to this matter of race mixing. His initial response is to say, "Agreed for once, 1,000 times agreed. There are white men enough to marry all the white women and black men enough to marry all the black women, and so let them be married." Lincoln cheerfully, even humorously, acknowledges that folks tend to stick to their own when it comes to marriage. His ready agreement has the effect of diffusing Douglas's attempt to stir up racial chauvinism. And then Lincoln's argument takes a bold turn. Citing the available census statistics on the number and residence of mixed-race individuals, Lincoln proves that the real cause of amalgamation, this thing that Douglas is so horrified by, the real cause of amalgamation is slavery. The problem isn't marriage between whites and free black people. The problem is the rape of black women by white masters. Lincoln is well aware that slavery violates not only the right to the fruits of one's labor, but the right to the integrity of one's body. He points out that where freedom exists, and even more, where civic equality exists, mixed-race unions are very rare. New Hampshire, the state, he says, which goes the farthest toward equality between the races, has the fewest mulattoes. This is a classic instance of Lincoln's brilliant redirection. He has taken the white fear of race mixing and shown how it ought to lead those who have that fear to endorse not only black freedom, but civic equality, or at least a greater degree of civic equality. Today, interracial marriage is no longer controversial. That welcome change can make it difficult for us to appreciate the strategy behind Lincoln's language. We expect all good people to be ostentatiously anti-racist. While I truly believe that Lincoln himself is quite free of racial prejudice, he doesn't make a big show of being morally outraged by racist views. In fact, he doesn't make any show at all of being morally outraged by racist views. He knows that attacking the core beliefs of one's audience doesn't generally win you any friends or any votes. Instead, through this cool numerical analysis, Lincoln tries to persuade even racial bigots that they ought to rethink their policy preferences. So Lincoln is willing to exploit racial chauvinism in order to further the anti-slavery cause, the more immediate cause. The The final step in his argument involves, I think, one further shift in tone. It is as if he has now prepared his audience to hear a higher type of appeal. Lincoln reminds us that the Dred Scott case, in which the slave Dred Scott sued for his freedom, that case involved not just a black man, but his wife and 2 daughters. With respect to this black family, Lincoln says, quote, "We desired the court to have held that they were citizens, so far at least as to entitle them to a hearing as to whether they were free or not, and then also that they were in fact and in law really free." End quote. Why did Lincoln care about Dred Scott, his wife, and 2 daughters? What was at stake? Here's what Lincoln says. "Could we have had our way, the chances of these black girls ever mixing their blood with that of white people would have been diminished at least to the extent that it could not have been without their consent." Lincoln enshrines the notion of consent, not only in the public political realm, but in the private, sexual realm. Lincoln is not outraged by race mixing, but by the violent and non-consensual aspect of such mixing as occurs inevitably under slavery. Lincoln contrasts his policy favoring black freedom with the effects of Douglas's endorsement of the Dred Scott decision. But Judge Douglas, he says, is delighted, this is a quote, "is delighted to have them decided to be slaves and not human enough to have a hearing, and thus left subject to the forced concubinage of their masters and liable to become the mothers of mulattoes in spite of themselves." I find this to be a profoundly empathetic statement. Lincoln has managed to move his listeners from Douglas's horror at the thought of the mixing of blood by the white and black races to sympathy for the daughters of Dred Scott, now sent back to the real horrors of slavery. In place of those bigoted caricatures of black men, he encourages his male listeners to put themselves in the shoes of Dred Scott. Dred Scott, the father of vulnerable daughters, daughters he will be powerless to protect from the depredations of the slave system. The argument has come full circle. Lincoln knows his audience is repelled by polygamy. He has now shown that American slavery, at least for women, is often a form of polygamy, and the worst kind of polygamy, forced concubinage. While not making any accusation against Dred Scott's master, Lincoln nonetheless indicates that a percentage of masters are inclined to exercise this particular power which they hold over their female slaves. At the very close of his speech, Lincoln sums up the 3 planks of the Republican position: that the Negro is a man, that his bondage is cruelly wrong, and that the field of his oppression ought not to be enlarged. All 3 derive from his understanding of the Declaration. Throughout the decade of the 1850s, Lincoln used his oratorical powers to revive the American faith in human equality. Uniquely in this speech, he sought to strengthen the anti-slavery sentiments of his audience, sentiments that Lincoln believed lay at the very foundation of our sense of justice, and he did that through his subtle focus on the fate of women. Lincoln manages to expand our human sympathies without sacrificing analytic rigor and without descending into either overt emotionalism or demagogic appeals to anger, as so many of the abolitionist orators did. By studying Lincoln's speeches, we learn of the Declaration's timeless power, the ever-present need to understand it rightly, and not least, the possibility of persuasive political speech that enlightens and ennobles its listeners. If only our nation could be blessed with the likes of Lincoln again. Thank you.
we've got just a hair under 15 minutes for Q&A, so I'll let Professor Shaw indicate her own order of questions. Don't be shy.
Yes.
I was just struck by a few things that you said, and I'm just wondering if you could comment a little bit more on them. One was that polygamy, you characterized it as people criticized it because of the way in which it was oppressive to women. I don't know that much about the time period, but my thought was that it was more criticized because of its effect on the nuclear family and the effect of the notion that there aren't enough women to go around if one man has too many of them, that it wasn't really so much about women, it was more about conceptions of society.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know a lot about this, but if you take a look, for instance, at the Supreme Court decision that, upheld the banning of polygamy, it's a very feminist argument. It's really an argument about equality, that you need one man, one woman produces equality in the household. And part of what you say about one man monopolizing many women, it was believed that that went together with a kind of theocracy and patriarchy. Yeah, I mean, I would just encourage you to look at that Supreme Court case where the argument is really a very feminist argument.
The other thing I was just curious about as well is when you talked about in the case of one woman, many men, that seems so different to me in the case of slavery, where it's interesting that you said that, because usually when people think about polygamy, they don't think about that as, slave owners raping women, and so you had one woman and many men. Most people don't think about that in the context of polygamy.
Yeah, although I actually think the model is still probably the master and access to his many women.
Right.
So that it's still a...
That's what I was just kind of thinking about, is that when people think about... all right, I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, thank you. I marvel at how carefully you read. And you can get new things out of the phrases that we've read many times.
Well, it helps to read people who write carefully, and I really think that Lincoln does.
Just a quick point to add to Lincoln and Limit. He really understood how powerful Harriet Beecher Stowe was.
Yes, but the little lady that is responsible for this war, yeah.
So my question is, the line Lincoln talking about the founders, they meant simply to declare the right that the enforcement of it might follow as fast as circumstances should permit. I have no doubt that for Lincoln, he moved as fast as circumstances would permit. I do have great doubts that what he described was true of the founding generation and of Jefferson. I'm interested in your view whether they really did everything against slavery that they could have been done under the circumstances.
Yeah, in general, I think that Lincoln is right, and to go through a speech of his like the Cooper Union Address, where he details everything that they did do, not only the immortal words of the Declaration, but a number of actions in the wake of that. Banning slavery in the Northwest Territories, ending the international slave trade at the earliest moment that it became constitutionally possible. He goes through a whole list of things, concrete actions that they took. If you look at individuals, I mean, you could take Jefferson and say, well, aren't we a little disappointed? Couldn't he have done a little bit more in his personal life? Partly it's that the wrong is a systemic wrong, and in a way can only be addressed systemically.
What I think is troubling about the Northwest Territories example is that at the same time that they banned slavery in the Northwest Territories, they allowed slavery in the Southwest Territories, which were expected to be the most population and wealthy and expansive. And that it was done in a way that almost implied that slavery was national and freedom local.
Yeah, I don't
The
know.
default position was that silence meant that slavery spread.
I don't know, but I mean, yeah, certainly there is a sort of battle going on, right, from the founding of the country forward between pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces, and which of those is going to have the upper hand. But I do think that Lincoln is right that the Constitution, even though it contains specific compromises with respect to the institution of slavery, the long continued existence of the institution of slavery, deprives the institution of any moral standing. And for Lincoln, that's what's so important. And so that what he's facing is the possibility that the nation will now will no longer regard slavery as a moral evil. I mean, he's fighting a kind of rearguard action.
Well, let's continue this.
Okay.
You highlighted the Gettysburg Address. 70 years ago, our forefathers brought forth this concept. They used nation. And I wonder if it is not conceivable that the most they could do was to create a nation. A nation which would ultimately have to confront this question and come to terms with it. In a context in which it could not be addressed except with the strength of the nation. However halting and timid it may have been at the outset. But as it grew in itself, and as it attained the power ultimately to address it, became the expression of the most that the founding could do, leaving the rest to the successors.
I don't think I need to add anything to that, Bill. I'm not going to call on you, Tom. Especially not when you're shaking your head as you raise your hand.
No, I just wonder, just to pick up on Jim's question. I mean, when Jefferson changes his mind, I mean, Lincoln spends all this time saying Jefferson is the origin of this, right? And he praises him for saying he's banished slavery in the Northwest Territories, and that's really, he's trying to establish this connection. He's clearly trying to wrap himself in the mantle of Jefferson, right? But we know Jefferson changes his mind. Jefferson, at the end of his life, Jefferson and Madison both. See, slavery needs to go everywhere through the territories, not because they like slavery.
Well, yeah, I mean, they never changed their mind about the injustice of slavery. I mean, you're saying Jefferson buys into this sort of diffusionist thesis, and we don't want to draw a geographic line that coincides with a moral line. He's worried about what that means for the future of the nation.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would just I mean, Lincoln has to know that it's not simply true that Jefferson said no slavery in the territories. Isn't he?
Yeah, well, it's true, and Lincoln himself, in which speech is it? I mean, absolutely rejects the Pollyanna diffusionist thesis, and he does not mention Jefferson's name in conjunction with it. But it's in Peoria. He calls it one of the lullaby arguments. I'm willing to grant that. I don't want the entire vindication of the founders to hinge on Jefferson either.
Sure.
Right? I mean, let's look at Hamilton. Let's look at Franklin, Adams.
Okay. All right.
Are there other student questions? I'll call on Gordon as soon as I get a student question. And I can wait you out, too.
She has 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I got a quick one for you. I like what you said a lot about just breaking apart Fourscore 7 years ago and why it was mathematical. It was very interesting.
Yeah.
And I was wondering whether you think how it's just beyond a human lifetime, the lifespan
Yeah.
at that moment, whether he was invoking that to say we're further on and we need to move ahead, or to say, look how, we're in the middle of a civil war, we're still with these debates, and we're not even, our nation started less than, or a little over a lifespan ago. So I was wondering whether he was talking about a further separation, or whether he was trying to invoke how quickly or how near we were to 1776.
Yeah, I think he is saying, so we're now beyond the range of living memory, right? Nobody in the audience could actually have been there in 1776. So he doesn't want to just move on, right, and get past that. He wants to get back to it, but it's now going to take a new kind of effort to get back to it. We can't just sit down with our grandparents and talk about it, right? I mean, it's actually the situation that we're facing right now with respect to the World War II generation. Right? There aren't very many of them left. That living history is going to be gone. We're going to have to find new modes of remembrance. So it does seem to me that that is what Lincoln's project is, an educational project, to educate Americans in the original meaning of their own founding charters, now that they no longer have that direct connection with them. Yes?
You were comparing how slavery is somewhat like tyranny. So I was wondering if there's any way that you could compare it to maybe like another, maybe the Athenians of how like they.
I'm sorry, the last part again?
The Athenian, the Athenian Constitution. Could you compare it in that way, saying how like the Athenians, in a way, they were kind of prejudiced towards other nations like who weren't completely full Athenians, or how you were talking about slavery and mixed races? Could you compare or find any more similarities between that or other?
I wasn't. Did you say the Athenian?
Yes, ma'am.
Like the ancient Athenians?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure about the question, but I mean there are some. I mean, all of these prior civilizations have had slavery, right? The Athenians had slavery. The Athenians also had certain sort of derogatory views about the barbarians and other nations and what they deserved. There are certain unique features, I think, of American slavery that make it very different from ancient slavery. Tocqueville was very interesting on this question, sort of talking about some of the unique features of American slavery that actually made it much harder to address and much harder to get rid of. I know I'm not answering your question. You want to see me afterwards?
I think we have time for one more.
I know Gordon did have a question.
I can wait for a question back then.
Yeah.
So, I don't know, if
You have to be a lot louder.
okay, but what do you think Lincoln's stance would have been on the civil rights?
Yeah, good. So, you know, in these speeches in the 1850s, when he's trying to fend off Stephen Douglas, who's constantly saying that what the Republicans want is, you know, full civil and political rights for blacks, Lincoln is always having to say, no, that's not what I'm saying, right? But it's very interesting. You have to look at all of those statements on Lincoln's part very, very carefully, and they are usually hedged about with qualifications. So he says things like, I am not now recommending full political and civil rights. He always sort of leaves it as an opportunity for the future. The fight that he is fighting is the anti-slavery fight. He knows there may come a time for that fight over civil rights. He doesn't want to do anything that will imperil the possibility of future progress on those questions. But he also knows that the anti-slavery coalition will break apart if you're sort of too far in advance of where most people are. In other words, his audience is composed of people who might well be or be persuaded to be anti-slavery, but they are also anti-black. They are bigoted. Right? And so those are the constraints within which he is working. But I think what you could see is that, I mean, the point that was made here about circumstances, and when circumstances change, it becomes new political possibilities arise. So during the Civil War, Lincoln, towards the end of the war, is already moving towards an embrace of the vote for African Americans. Perhaps a qualified vote, a vote for those African Americans who have fought in the Union ranks. There's a very nice formulation that comes from a Lincoln scholar. He says that that Lincoln's death was not the final death of the Civil War, it was the first death of the civil rights struggle. Booth decided to assassinate Lincoln when he heard Lincoln come out in favor of the vote for African Americans. That was the moment at which Booth decided to assassinate Lincoln. So you...
All right, please. Thank you very much.